everyone for joining us. I know it's a busy time of the semester, so I appreciate you taking the time. We do have people here in the audience in person as well as online from wherever they may be around the world. I'm Mercedes Bravo. I'm an assistant professor here at the Global Health Institute and the moderator of today's Think Global panel, which is Clearing the Air and Water, Environmental Justice and Health. Before we begin, I've been asked to give a few logistical notes. We will have time for Q&A following panelists' brief presentations. We welcome questions from people online and in the audience. People who are here in the room, please just raise your hands when we get to the Q&A part. Online participants, please put your questions in the chat at any time during the session. We will be monitoring those and we'll get to as many as we can during the conversation. And then last but not least, today's session will be recorded and posted publicly. So this content will be available to you and others after this. So just know that things that you say, questions you ask will be recorded. And I think that's all the logistics. So we'll move on to the substance. Today's panel centers around issues of environmental justice, which can be defined in multiple ways. Just as one example, the US EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This is certainly not the only or the correct definition of environmental justice. Some might argue that it's actually rather narrow, but it at least gives us some common language to start from. So having said that, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I'm going to very briefly introduce everybody and note that their bios, full bios, can be found on the website on DGHI's event listing. So at the far right, I have Dr. Kay Jowers, who is Director of Just Environments at the Duke Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, Sustainability and the Keenan Institute for Ethics. And her work centers on fostering partnerships among scholars, students, and community co-researchers to uncover and address underlying causes of environmental and climate injustices. Then we have Dr. Caven Ward-Cavanis, who's a senior scientist at the US EPA. He uses data science to answer previously intractable questions on how the environment, both social and chemical, impact health and well-being. And then here to my right, Dr. Nisha Jayasundara, who's the Julie Plant Granger Assistant Professor of Global Environmental Health at the Nicholas School of the Environment, with secondary appointments here at DGHI and the School of Medicine. And Dr. Jayasundara's research focuses on shedding new light on the adverse ecological and human health impacts of chemical pollution and climate change. All right, Dr. Ward-Cavanis and Dr. Jayasundara will be speaking about environmental justice with respect to health effects of environmental contamination, as well as climate change. And Dr. Jowers is going to be our third speaker, and we'll talk about how the Biden administration has approached environmental justice policy here domestically, as well as how the Environmental Justice Lab that she directs and her group approach co-researching with communities that are most interested. And our order of operations here is going to be Dr. Ward-Cavanis, Dr. Jayasundara, and then Dr. Jowers. Panelists, your presentations should be right around 5 minutes, which will leave us plenty of time for discussion. I think we can start. Yeah, you have your clicker? Perfect.
Let's see if this works. All right. Well, it's nice to be here speaking with all of you, both in person and online. As Mercedes said, my name is Dr. Caven Ward-Cavanis. I'm a principal investigator at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Specifically, my group focuses on two aspects of understanding the environment and health. One aspect is sort of the clinical effects of the environment, which we study using electronic health records. We've been a sort of novel user of those resources for environmental health studies. And the other aspect is the molecular aspect of it. So how does the environment sort of get underneath the skin in this both the social and chemical environment to then alter our biology in such a way that it produces health effects that we all sort of know and understand at this point for it. And all of this would like sort of aim towards understanding how we can understand environmental susceptibility and on the reverse of it, people who are resistant to environmental health effects for it, and perhaps transfer some of those qualities from one group to another, or at least understand them in a way that can be addressed via interventions. So this is a slide that I start a lot of my presentations with, and it simply says, as the title says, where you live matters. For it. I work a lot with a number of different fields. I myself come from a statistical genetics background within there, and I've worked a lot with cardiologists and other clinicians over the course of my career, and it's really impactful, in a lot of different fields outside of, global health or environmental health, how little people consider where you live and how that's going to impact your life trajectory or your current trajectory from wherever you move to. This is a slide from a report done by the city of Los Angeles back in 2015, I believe, where they set this map out what the life expectancy across Los Angeles was like. And they found that it was generally fairly high, would be the 11th, ranked country in the world if Los Angeles were a country according to life expectancy. But you can find pockets like this throughout the city where you have these two nearby neighborhoods for it. The one outlined in black is named Walnut Park. The one outlined in red is named Cudahy. I believe I pronounced that likely incorrectly, but close enough, hopefully, for it. And you can see that these two neighborhoods at their nearest point are separated by one less than a full city block. Sort of the short end of a sort of city block there. However, the life expectancy in Cudahy is about 80 years, whereas in Walnut Park is slightly over 90 years. And so you have to ask the question of, well, what kind of factors can lead to this difference? You could ask the obvious questions, maybe it's racial differences, maybe it's economic differences. And I can tell you that both of these are primarily Hispanic communities, lower income, both have a below median level of education, at least according to collegiate achievement within there for it, and both have fairly similar owner-occupied housing rates within that. And so it's not really a lot of the primary social determinants that at least on the surface are driving this. Now there's a lot below the surface that's not captured by these sort of standard census variables that we could dig into. But of course, being an environmental scientist, one of my things is, okay, what's the environment like? For here. And so I look at this picture and I see these differences and I notice that, well, Cudahy's bordered by this, river that's got a lot of shipping as well as a large highway, for there, whereas Walnut Park has on its other side a large park, that's its name for as well. And so some of those environmental factors, while not likely accounting for 10 years of life expectancy within a 15-minute walk, certainly are contributing factors to this. And this has sort of been a driver of how I seek to understand differences in health inequities at very local scales or perhaps even grand nationwide scales, but how the environment contributes to those. As we think about the relationship between, say, air pollution and environmental injustices, my group seeks to look at these from multiple aspects of it. And so at the top here, you sort of have these sort of a variety of air pollution sources, which include sort of the standard ones we think about, traffic, maybe wildfires as well. If we come in there, but also things like biogenic emissions from there, which can come from plants even, photogenic or photochemical reactions in the atmosphere produce ozone, which can impact communities as well. Agriculture, for it, certainly a large contributor to, air quality in some communities for it. And when you think about environmental injustices, which I formed from this slide, for it, I think about sort of the differential impacts of environmental exposures on people's lives for it that come about through socially determined factors within there. And so environmental injustice might mean that a community is exposed to increased levels of air pollution for it, or they're exposed to more toxic mixtures of air pollution. How do we understand how that is both determined by the socioeconomic conditions of a community, but also how it's responsive to those socioeconomic conditions of a community? If a new factory moves in, how does that alter the air quality or the water quality mix within that community that might make it more, maybe even less toxic, replacing a more toxic source to begin there with. But we also have to think about environmental injustice from how those social factors that begin at perhaps even a preconception stage lead to greater responses to the air quality that we all experience. Most individuals have fairly little control over the air quality that they're going to experience on a day-to-day basis. I don't get to wake up and tell a certain factory to shut down because I'm going to go for a run today for it, or tell a certain wildfire to stop because I want to go outside and enjoy nice clear skies for there. And so for most communities, air quality is sort of an invariant background to there. But the social factors on the ground can cause how somebody will, or change how people will respond to that air quality, and that can also manifest as an environmental injustice. And this is sort of a final slide, but I like to think of this as how we can conceptualize environmental justice and sensitivity to air pollution for it. And as I said, so these can mean that environmental injustice can mean, in concept of air pollution, being exposed to more toxic air pollution, higher concentrations, or social stressors that increase susceptibility to that. And when we think about susceptibility to air pollution, we oftentimes think about air pollution as sort of this, causal factor within cardiovascular and pulmonary diseases, but those are going to be for people at the top of this pyramid here They're going to be experiencing sort of doctor visits or emergency room admissions, for that. So there's a broad spectrum of air quality related health effects that even generally healthy people will experience, including inflammation, lung function decrements that over time might accumulate for it. And environmental injustice can move you up these rungs of the ladder, so to speak, so that maybe in a perfectly just society, you might have people generally occupying some of the lower levels of this. But environmental justice might stratify which communities appear at the top of this pyramid that are experiencing the most severe effects from air pollution from those communities that might be exposed to very similar mixtures for it. You might have these two communities experiencing very similar air pollution, gradients for it, but one community might be much higher on the rungs of this pyramid than the other due to some of the underlying factors there. And so with that, I'll pass to the next speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ward-Cavaness. That was a great sort of a platform for what I want to show you and share with you. So, as Mercedes said, my name is Nishad Sundara. I'm an assistant professor here, in the Nicholas School, but also part of the DTHI group of researchers who are really trying to understand a lot of different aspects of health around the world. And one area that's really emerging is how global communities are being impacted by changes in the environment around us. And a major focus for our research group is to think about kidney health and how kidneys are impacted by changes in the environment. And that's important partly because we all have kidneys, so we should all care about it, but also it's also the largest filter in our body. But we're also seeing an emergence of kidney diseases around the world, as highlighted by this Time magazine article that said chronic kidney disease is poised to become the black lung of climate change. So we are beginning to pay attention to kidney diseases as a potential health outcome that is linked to both climate change, but also other changes associated with that in the environment. And this is already occurring in communities around the world, this phenomenon. It is highlighted by this emergence of chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology, also called CKDU, in many parts of the world. So just to show a quick map around the world that shows the communities that are impacted by CKDU. Hopefully you can see this on the map on the screen. Many countries in Mesoamerica, so Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Panama, Costa Rica, number of communities in India and Sri Lanka, number of communities in East Asia, number of communities that are emerging now with CKDU incidences in parts of Africa, including in Ethiopia and South Africa. So we're beginning to see that communities around the world are seeing this rise in kidney diseases. And what's really striking about this is that it's occurring in farming communities primarily, and it's occurring around the tropical belt, so hot and warm regions of the world. And just recently, we are beginning to see evidences of this unexplained version of kidney disease in the United States, especially among migrant farm workers here in North Carolina, in Texas, in Arkansas, and California. So what is this? We don't really know. So it's a kidney disease. People are presented with failing kidneys at the ages of as young as 35 to 36 years of age. They show up at the hospital. They're pretty already at late-stage kidney, end-stage kidney failure. So there's not so much that a physician can do at that point. So there's a lot of effort that needs to happen in terms of understanding what's leading up to this disease, because it's impacting many communities that are highly reliant on farming as a source of income. So just to allude back to the point about the top of the ladder, these are communities that are trying to feed the rest of the country, rest of the world, and are being impacted by the very service that they're trying to provide, right? So if you look at the numbers, we're seeing 1 in 3 men in one community in Nicaragua impacted by CKDU. 60% of the farmers in this one community in Uddanam, India, are impacted by CKDU. They call it the widowmaker disease because primarily men end up farming, and they seem to be the people who end up dying from CKDU. We're seeing a 5-fold increase in some of the communities in El Salvador, Nicaragua. In Sri Lanka alone, we're seeing about 20,000 to 40,000 people at end-stage renal failure. So just around the world, they're seeing this significant impact on people already at end stages. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of understanding what's causing this And that's some of the work we're doing in my research group, together with a number of collaborators around Duke and other places, including Mercedes Bravo. What's causing this? We don't really know, but the two major factors that everybody's focused on right now is heat stress and dehydration, because we know that those two elements can affect kidney health. And because this is occurring primarily in agricultural societies, there's a role for chemicals that are in the environment, whether it's aerosolized or whether it's in the water. A lot of our work has shown that there's increasing contamination in the drinking water of these communities that are impacted. And that contamination is exacerbated by climate change, because we're seeing increasing drought seasons. So chemicals are concentrating more in the drinking water sources, but also people are using more chemicals now because their crops are being damaged from increasing drought seasons. So they want to maximize yield in a short period of time. So you're beginning to use more and more chemicals. So a number of different ways this shift in environment is affecting how we use our chemicals and how we change the chemical environment around us. And obviously, there's a lot of work that's going into understanding this, but I want to leave with several key questions that we end up thinking a lot about in my research group, and I think broadly around the CKD research community, which is how do we tackle this emergence of what we call climate disease frontline communities, right? These are communities that had nothing to do with the carbon emissions that happen in the world. These are 2,000, 3,000-year-old civilizations based on agriculture, and now beginning to see the negative impacts of environmental change that happened in the industrialized world. So how do we identify these communities? How do we prevent future communities emerging? And especially, how do we focus on younger populations, especially children and adolescents in these communities, to make sure that they don't have to deal with some of the health effects that are happening from this environmental shifts we're seeing. So with that, I'll switch over to you.
I don't have any slides.
Yes.
So I'm good. Thank you. I'm Kay Jowers, and as Mercedes said earlier, I am here at Duke and I run a program called Just Environments, and we partner with communities, faculty, decision makers, and students and staff to do research that addresses climate and environmental injustices. And we do that through two ways. We invest in deep collaborative relationships with a few communities, but those kinds of deep collaborative relationships to address environmental justice policy require long-term commitment and long-term engagement because of the nuance and the complexity of some of these issues, as you've seen in the other two presentations. So we can't scale that very much. We invest very deeply in a few at a time, and still, though, want to be able to provide additional resources. And so that's when we have the Duke Environmental Justice Lab that comes in, which is our sort of quantitative arm that works on more discrete project-based approaches, where we'll put together teams of, I think most of the stakeholders in the room are co-researchers on those teams to answer discrete research questions that we primarily want to come to us from the communities. So we want to help the communities research problems that they define as the problems that they are experiencing. And most often we want to do that in a way that's policy relevant, because the two institutes that my program rests within are very interested in supporting decision-making and policy around these issues and how we further justice. So what I've been asked to speak to today is the policy and regulatory approaches to environmental and climate justice. And I will attempt to give you a broad overview and hope you will ask questions about which area you are most interested in hearing about, because it's very different at the global, at the national, at the state, at the local level, depending on the context you're talking about, what the tools are available there. So broadly, one, if you're paying attention to the COP right now, that's a great opportunity to see how climate and environmental justice policy play out in the decisions that will be made in the coming weeks about what's going to happen with how communities and how countries in the global south and other communities should be compensated for harm from climate change. So there's a case study you could hopefully are paying attention to now with that happening. And then at a national level, the definition that Mercedes gave at the very beginning of this panel is one that's really rooted in the Civil Rights Act. And so most of our environmental justice policy at a national level, and much of it at a sub-national level in the United States, is really based on the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. And so it's based in this framework of preventing discrimination. And if you read Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, it reads that it prevents discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And it's tied to the connection to a federal program or a federal program of assistance. And that's been the basis of much of our environmental justice policy in the United States for a long time. And if you've been paying attention to interpretations around affirmative action from coming out of the Supreme Court, some of the interpretations of the Civil Rights Act make it really challenging for redressing past harm. But as Dr. Ward-Cavan has pointed out in the first slide, where you live matters. And many of the built environments in the neighborhoods in the United States that we're working in to address climate and environmental injustices, those were laid out and established prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And without a mechanism to address that past harm, it makes it quite challenging moving forward for figuring out those regulatory approaches to how we create more environmental justice. So one of the things that the Biden administration has done is figure out how to target investments in infrastructure and investments in particularly infrastructure that might address climate resilience and climate adaptation, to have those benefits of those investments flow to those historically marginalized communities, those historically disinvested in communities. So one of the things that you might hear a lot about is the Justice 40 initiative. So in one of the executive orders that the Biden administration adopted in the first month they were in office, they put in place this requirement that around 40% of the benefits of any investments in the climate infrastructure need to flow to historically underserved and marginalized communities. That was then defined by a separate executive order on advancing racial equity. And it specifically lists, a number of subgroups and calls attention to groups that historically maybe weren't recognized in other policies, including people with disabilities, LGBTQIA communities, and many other groups. It is also, though, based in that same framework of the Civil Rights Act of we don't want to see any discrimination. And so there's this one does the best job possible of creating mechanisms to address past harm, but we're still operating in that framework of none of these programs can violate that Civil Rights Act and create racial discrimination. And that might be discrimination against white populations that might have had more privilege. And so that's the challenge with the regulatory tools that we have available. And the Biden administration is attempting to circumvent that with this deep investment of all of these funds into programs and projects that will benefit these communities. That affects the research community and the university community in that there are new mechanisms available to do research, to implement programs and case studies, all sorts of projects and programs where you can work with communities and or apply for programs where you are making an argument that the benefits of your research are flowing to those underserved communities. So that's the primary mechanism right now the federal government is using to address climate and environmental injustice. States have gone much further and been more restrictive, particularly in the Northeast and in California. And I'm happy to talk more about that once we get into conversation. Some of the ways that we try to support that policy work at the Just Environments and the AJ Lab are working with communities when they want to apply for one of these programs to help them with designing a research project that might, meet those requirements. So, and other times we end up working on policy issues that don't sound at all like the things I just described. It might be more about the local government or the community needs some help in defending a policy like a moratorium on electricity disconnections as a public health measure that can help alleviate energy injustices that have existed in the United States. So the types of policy adjacent research that we do runs the gamut, and I look forward to the discussion so we can get into more detail about it.
Fantastic, thank you. I have a bunch of questions, but I think I'd really like to open it up to the audience first and see if you all want to get us started. Don't be shy.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
It relates a little bit to the comment about the cops and the debate, at least part of the debate that's been going on from the previous COP and to this one is about liability, essentially. What those of us who have been destroying the climate owe, particularly to like small island countries and other very vulnerable places. And to me, it touches upon the issue in a way of reparations. It's related to reparations, right? Because you're essentially arguing that we have created these vulnerabilities, and it's going to cost money to resolve them. And I wonder how much of that is or is not a part of any of the climate mitigation, environmental justice arguments for this country.
I think it's not enough a part of the conversations in the United States, and part of it is this challenge that our laws are really based in preventing racial discrimination of any sort, and so any sort of positive discrimination to address past harm has been a non-starter thus far. So I think we should be having more conversations about that, and in order to move things forward. And hopefully that conversation at an international level does open more space for us to have that discussion in the domestic US. But thus far, I haven't really heard it come up much. We tend to focus less on the racial equity aspect of environmental justice policy in a lot of these discussions, and I wish we talked more about it.
Can I add a little bit in terms of the global perspective? I think the point you're raising is extremely important, but unfortunately, we don't have a system currently in place to tackle that, right?
Yeah.
Because when you think about, let's say lead, for example, if a company in northern Canada releases lead and that lead ends up in Greenland, there's really no convention to come to an agreement on who should be held responsible. And that's happening across the world with chemicals, and the same thing is translating into climate change impacts. And whenever there's a discussion around that, and there's this discussion around reparations and how do we pay back communities that are impacted, often that comes with strings attached. So especially in some of the countries in low and middle income communities, they would request perhaps aid in the name of how do we repair back the issues that happened from industrialization happened in your country, and that would come with an aid package. That aid package would come with another set of strings attached. So perhaps in some ways it's better not to ask for it, because you may end up getting into a deeper problem that in trying to find a solution in that. So I just don't think there's a platform built for that that level of conversation to happen that goes beyond borders.
Question. Curious about besides the research, how do you also incorporate steps to communicate the science appropriately? Because I'm from Bolivia, and in Bolivia it's a very conflicted society. And let's say a university does a study, and they find something, and as students, very eager to share the news, and they can run the newspaper. And then there's a lot of politics and conflict happening, right? And very physical problems can occur. So I'm curious to hear about maybe from EPA and also at the university level, how could you develop systems, or if you are developing systems, to make sure when you find something, it's shared appropriately so that it doesn't explode and becomes a political problem.
Yes, a really good question. I would say those systems are being built, and there's probably some places that do it a lot better than others in terms of actually translating, research results into not just communications, but also implementations, interventions, and decision-making, that's really where we want this to go forward. You can publish a mountain of papers, but if you don't actually do something in a community, what does it mean, especially when you're talking about, environmental injustices and those factors for it. At the EPA, we are a regulatory agency, and so our mandate is to fix things, or at least to not let things get worse, for it. Now, there's a lot of layers of politics, that go on top of that for it, but we do have, arms of the EPA that do nothing but, communication of science, and, that communication goes out to communities, but it also goes out to politicians for it, who oftentimes are simply people from communities. And we oftentimes can forget about that, and sort of the reframing of the political sphere is just this amorphous thing that makes decisions and we have to live by it. But a lot of times, getting things impacted also means communicating the importance of it to political leaders. And oftentimes that comes both from the communities themselves getting information from scientists, but also occasionally, scientists either at the EPA or otherwise, speaking to Congress or liaising with local political offices and those things. I think there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of communicating to the communities that are most impacted, and doing it in a way that makes it clear what the benefit is going to be for them. There's been a long history of scientists going into communities saying, give us your data, give us your samples, let us, invade your homes and lands and collect these things, and then go off and we'll publish a nice science paper, and maybe we'll send you a copy of it and we'll host a community hearing, and then that's the end of it. I think an emerging wave of what's, community-based participatory science, where community, based members are actually involved in the science making process. And there's expectation, if not a mandate, for these results to go back to the communities, and the communities to comment on, well, here's how it was helpful to me, and here's how this impacted our community, is really helping to advance, science communication, and hopefully to prevent some of those problems that you discussed. Because a lot of that friction occurs when things just suddenly happen in a community, or when they happen in a way that the community doesn't understand or didn't approve. And so setting up the scientific process to involve the communities from the beginning, which is a novel aspect to an academic PI thinking of an idea, applying for a grant, and then going to a community saying, here's what we're going to do to you. That's a very different framework of thinking, but I think it's one that's really helping to benefit, scientific communication.
I have a question. It's about the chronic kidney disease of unknown origin. So it sounds like a public health emergency, because we have 60% of a whole village and 1 in every 3 men, but I'm hearing about it for the first time today. So what's the world doing about it?
Can you repeat the last bit?
Like, what is the world doing about it?
The world.
Yes.
No, great question, and I think goes back to the previous question too. So, from within an academic framework, what we are expected to do, at least in my case, is to publish and write grants, right? And that does not involve me going out and speaking in front of communities. It does not involve me going to other countries that don't have surveillance systems and try to probe those communities to see, can we look for this disease in your community, right? So as Dr. Kevin was saying earlier, as academic structures are built through the sort of the traditional processes, we don't really have the means in place to really go and do something about it right away. And I think that's changing. I think Duke's doing a lot of work to really change that. I see DJ Chai, the Nicholas School is some of the frontiers in trying to change that mindset. Specifically in our case, we've done a lot of work in Sri Lanka to work with the local partners, the communities, the local farming associations, also with the Ministry of Health in the country, as well as we have a nonprofit set up in the country to really move the public communication aspect of that forward. But that's one community, one location, right? There's a lot more going on around the world, and we are not doing enough, to be honest. And that's probably why you haven't heard about it.
Great, other questions? I guess a question that I had is, do we need to rethink these sort of regulatory thresholds for, you know, either toxicity or just sort of contamination of chemicals. And I think this was a question that you brought up, Nishad, in the face of climate change, you know, either because, you know, people do have increased susceptibility, potentially because of climate change, or because you have issues of kind of concentration of chemicals because we're using more chemicals because we have more pests, or we're using more chemicals because we have more drought. You know, or, you know, we're producing more air pollution because we're running our air conditioning, you know, more because it's hotter, right, et cetera. And so, you know, and how does their sort of regulatory, how do regulatory mechanisms sort of need to grapple, you know, with that? I pose this to anybody who wants to tackle it from whatever perspective.
Well, I'll tackle it from some of the EPA's perspective. So, you know, the EPA is constantly refining the regulatory standards for it. You know, we have the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which set, you know, various standards for criteria air pollutants, things like particulate air pollution and ozone, say, okay, this is what, you know, different, you know, cities or regions abide by, and there's a lot of complexity that goes into there. But I think what's important and what's not always been recognized within the writing of those laws, and perhaps it was pre-edition at the time for it, is that they're not set to say, okay, well, this is what the, you know, average rate of risk must be, you know, for it. But there actually is a clause in there that says that these must be protective for vulnerable groups, you know, within there. And over time, that definition of vulnerable groups, I think, has changed. And I think we're moving into an era where that definition of vulnerable groups, you know, encompasses historically discriminated communities as well as those that are impacted by climate change. Now, a barrier to that is that there has to be a body of science to support that. And while there certainly is a lot of scientific publications and things like that for it, you know, crafting a regulatory body of science, and if we want to know what one looks like, simply go look up the integrated science assessment for any of the air pollutants. You'll get about a couple hundred pages going through everything from the toxicology, the risk assessment, the epidemiology, you know, every aspect of it to say, okay, we believe that the PM standard should be, you know, X and not, you know, X plus one for it. And there has to be evidence that, you know, X instead of X plus one is a good standard, that lowering it is a good thing to do for there. And so there's a lot that we need to do as researchers, but I think there's a lot that we need to do to understand the regulatory and even political, you know, nature that we work in for it to understand, like, well, what do those people need? And this sort of goes back to the question of communication, because that's really all science is communication. Telling the story of the data that the world runs on is the scientific process, no matter what your field really is. For it. If you do an experiment and tell nobody about it, it might as well not have even happened. And there's been a lot of those in the past. And if you do an experiment and it's not based on any data, then you're just, you know, theorizing, philosopher, or, you know, some other aspect of it. But that combination of data and storytelling is what makes science. And for too long, we haven't considered who we're telling the story to, or who is most impactful to tell a story to, and how we craft those stories for it. And that looks different for a regulator than it does for an associate editor at a journal, and looks different for a community member than it does for a politician. But we, in some ways, have the mechanisms, at least from the United States EPA standpoint, to, you know, be protective in climate change scenarios. But what we need to increase is our ability as scientists and researchers to make sure that we're studying those populations and doing it in a way that the groups that have to make these decisions and form these frameworks can understand and utilize, sometimes within historically clunky frameworks a little bit, but, you know, we do have to sort of fit it into the laws that we have, at least while we work to craft new ones that might be able to be even more protective than our current sets.
Great.
If
I could just add to that, to echo all of that, we do have these mechanisms that can be used in creative ways and should be, not just for climate change, but if we also consider, particularly in Indigenous communities, risk assessments may not consider the appropriate level of consumption of different resources. So are you truly considering the amount of fish consumption that a community really relies on, if it's a subsistence fishing community, or just a community where fish is an important part of the culture and the diet, and we maybe need to make some exceptions, and should have been all along making exceptions for those places where that kind of justice consideration was called for. And they are contemplated in some of the existing mechanisms, but we still don't have, they aren't necessarily coming up unless those communities find a partnership with a researcher or are really proactive in advocating for themselves and have organizations working with them because of all of the reasons that everyone has been referring to about how difficult this can be for a community to engage in this process and know what stories and what data and what information is going to be compelling to the decision makers and what information they may not know about their own community. So, you know, in the case of going to the newspaper with results of research, there's also a lot of the ethical implications of, do we need to make sure that we've communicated this to the community first, and do we have solutions and mechanisms, or are we going to be raising an issue that will be very concerning and likely increase some of the other stresses on this community without giving them good options? So there's many considerations.
I was just going to ask about the particular aspects of the EPA, but also other regulatory frameworks in terms of extreme heat. And you know where that sits in policy and governments, because that has emerged very quickly as a major health threat, climate change, and it's different from toxicologic environmental exposures, water, air standards, right? And but it turns out it's very important for vulnerable groups like pregnant women, but also agricultural workers, outdoor laborers, a whole really different set of people.
Yeah, I think, for extreme heat is a great example because it's one that like wasn't considered in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, where a lot of this environmental regulatory framework was emerging from it. But, as I said, the language was broad and there's, some aspects in there. But there's also non-regulatory aspects, to this. So, even within the EPA, we have, a mechanism that, I've utilized and a lot of others have, called the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. And it, monitors water, public water systems primarily but for unregulated contaminants. And you can see a lot of movement in, the news media when those reports get released, because they tell you where things like PFAS are occurring and where, other contaminants of interest. And this is in a non-regulatory framework, it could potentially lead towards regulation. But even simply letting a community know that they're being impacted by something, they have like an awareness of it, like putting it down in data for them that they can take to somebody and say, hey, like, fix this, can be very impactful, especially for something like, extreme heat, which can be oftentimes impacted by local building conditions, urban heat islands, lack of available green space for it. Well, if you're a local community, planner, if you're on the county commission for it and your community members show up 500 strong and say, hey, fix this heat problem we have, for it. This research has shown that it's a major problem for our community. That can be very impactful for whether you put a park or a parking lot in there next. And so I think, moving beyond, regulation and thinking creatively about, okay, well, maybe there's not an extreme heat advisory for it, but maybe there's a mechanism for implementing that locally or nationally, and simply communicating that and letting people empower themselves with it can oftentimes be a good stopgap while we work to build, an extreme heat, regulatory framework that, can function within our existing, mechanisms.
Yeah.
Can I actually ask a follow-up? And it's based on the conversation we were having earlier. I wonder we were talking before the panel started about cumulative impacts and multiple harms. Are any of the frameworks for decision making around cumulative impacts, do you think, helpful for extreme heat?
Very likely, because extreme heat is going to be a stressor. I mean, we go back to the dehydration, for it, certainly your kidneys are going to be a major impact of dehydration, but your entire cardiovascular system starts to go a little awry when you start to get dehydrated. And so you'll see cardiovascular effects, you'll see neurological effects, from it. And, those effects can often begin with one or other stressor. Maybe they begin with a social stress, for it, or maybe they begin with water pollution or air pollution for there. But extreme heat just ratchets it up a little bit. If you think back to that sort of pyramid I have, maybe you're in the lower rung of like mild health effects for it, but you add extreme heat, and maybe you're moving up a couple of levels of this pyramid to more and more severe effects. And so, I think understanding where that happens and how that happens, and letting communities know that like, yes, it might not be that a hot summer day is going to rush people to the emergency room for it, but it's going to tip a lot of the more vulnerable members of the community over into, you know, a new health status they might have been able to avoid for it, or cause, you know, some of these emerging diseases like, you know, chronic kidney disease of unknown origin for there, which is, you know, growing for it. And, you know, there's some other studies, I think, going on between the EPA and Duke that are looking at that as well. For it can let these people know, oh, this is a problem, and we need to get ahead of it faster than the regulatory mechanisms will allow, because regulation is slow, very, very powerful, but oftentimes quite slow. Other things can move a lot faster than, say, set a new regulation for extreme heat.
Question about whether your research or the work that you guys do follows the money, thinking about how that reaches audiences, governments a lot more typically of what is the cost. Do you guys include that in any of your research or thinking about what we're doing? Of like putting a dollar amount to it? I feel like that speaks more to people.
You mean in terms of the cost of that, not regulating that, right?
The cost of someone losing their life and not being able to farm anymore, the cost of this infrastructure affecting the lives of these families, you know, that just thinking of what will reach someone's ears more.
Right, so whose ears are we trying to reach, I guess, is something to think
All
about,
of
right?
the above.
So, yeah, so in terms of thinking about the regulatory agencies and trying to, and I kind of, maybe the word is not disheartened, but sitting next to a regulatory agency representative to hear that regulatory agencies are slow is disheartening, right? Because communities that are most impacted need the regulation yesterday, right? So, but it is slow, and it's by design, that's how it's come to be. So how do we get the ears of the people who are making the laws? And that has to happen through community organization. And I can't agree more, because especially in some of these CKDU impact communities, for example, communities that are most organized have been able to advocate for themselves to get access to clean water, get access to better regulations around pesticide usage, get access to organic fertilizer, right? So the communities that are impacted, I think their ears are already open and they know what's going on. It's how do we get the ears of the lawmakers to actually change their action? And to do that, I think we need much better community organizing potential to be delivered to these communities. And that's something that I don't know how we would do that through the academic structures, right? We don't have that that built in into us. So how do you then use the cost of an impact to communicate? That is again tricky, because it goes back to the question of reparations, right? Because then it counts towards who's responsible. And let's say you do put a value on something and say this is costing this farmer's life, which means it's going to cost X amount of dollars for the local economy. Then who do you go back and say, now pay us back because we lost X dollars?
Not even thinking reparations. I was thinking of just like, I think it would perk people's ears up more of like, wait a minute, this is costing me this as a government official, as a community member, this is costing me this much because of this issue. Let's fix it sooner rather than later. Just thinking out loud here.
I think that's a fair, sorry.
I think it's a really good thing, and I think that's, you know, part of what we haven't done a really good job at communicating for it. So the federal law with the greatest economic benefit to the United States to date, you know, as far as I know, is the Clean Air Act. And there have been a number of people who've looked at this. The costs versus the benefits of the Clean Air Act are clearly on the benefit side of it. For there, almost no matter how you look at, you know, the data for there. But I think those costs are a little bit hard, because the costs of implementing are very direct costs. We're going to pay $100 or $200, you know, dollars per person or whatever it is in, you know, a community or a nation, equivalently to, you know, clean up this factory or add air filters or improve parks for there. And then there's going to be a lot of hidden costs of things that didn't happen because of their, you know, deaths that did not occur or occurred much later, hospitalizations that did not occur, cardiovascular disease avoided. But that's a little bit hard for us as people to understand in almost any context. Like the idea of giving up something to avoid, you know, potential future harms. We can get that as individuals, but sometimes I think as populations, we don't always have the right frameworks for communicating that. And so the cost, I think, is a really big thing. And the more we can see environmental, remediation, as a, cost saver in the long term and, perhaps even in the short term, the more we'll be able to accelerate some of these and also get new players involved for it. I work a lot with hospital systems, so I think a lot about, how can other people in the healthcare, industry be involved in environmental risk management, for there. Maybe, insurance companies would like people to stop, to prevent people from having hospitalizations. Well, environmental risk management could be a part of that strategy, for it. I think there is some movement on this, and there are people that are waking up to being like, oh, these things happening are costing for-profit companies something, which certainly starts to move the needle for it. But communities should also be able to say like, oh, like this is not just good for us, health-wise, this is an economic benefit to our community. But sometimes that message can be hard, even though we have agencies that are devoted to that, or at least arms of agencies that are devoted to that. That sort of cost trade-off, pay now to save later from things that won't occur, can sometimes be a little difficult.
And that's really what you see even with climate change too, right? It's like we have to act now to save the future, and there's real difficulty in doing that, although we'll see what happens with the COP. To Kay's point, I think too, just related to this, I mean, the question that you're asking is a great one. It's also one that I think environmental economists and sort of health economists wrestle with a lot, which is not represented on this panel. And also a real frustration of mine that there's always this kind of juxtaposition of the economy, versus the environment, right? And it is really like the economy and the environment. And I think part of, what gets lost in that story or the spin there, right, is that, yeah, you have these, as Kevin said, these direct upfront costs, right? And then you have all these benefits that are, quite complicated to, identify and cost, because how many people's lives did we save? How many people didn't move up to the next risk tier and need more asthma medications, right? Those are difficult, right? And so I think we get into this debate about the economy versus the environment, and it really should be, the two of them together.
I think we are seeing some progress though in that conversation, primarily because of the number of natural disasters that we're seeing and the dollar amount it costs insurance companies, particularly for property damage. So that's the area where I see the most progress in putting costs on those sorts of things, but we certainly need to have it expanding and to these other areas as well. It's the reinsurers actually who are driving a lot of the conversation around putting costs on things that I hear. And if you're not familiar with what reinsurers are, they're basically the insurance companies for the insurance companies. So, and they care a lot because if the insurance companies are repeatedly having to pay out for natural disasters related to climate change, then that's, going to hurt their bottom line. So they have been for the past 5 years, really the ones pushing that conversation forward. And I think there's beginning to be much more support for having much more sophisticated cost of benefit analyses that happen, but the methods, and how we do that is certainly for any of the students in the room, great area that needs more people thinking about it.
And I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, yeah, we have a few online ones, but I'll post the shorter one.
Sure.
Nishad, this was in regards to the map you had up earlier. Are we seeing kidney disease in children also in the same regions that the adults are being impacted? That was shown on the map.
Great question. I hope they're in a review panel at NIH next year.
Yeah.
Yes. So what we are seeing is that there is increasing kidney damage in children in the impacted communities. And if you go to CKDU community in Sri Lanka, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, these are where the data are coming from currently. They are seeing that children at the ages of between 8 to 16 are showing increasing signs of kidney damage. Does that actually end up leading to end-stage kidney failure? We don't know, and that's something we would really want to look into. But it does seem like the disease incidence and initiation starts early in life, and that's again comes back to the point of how do you put a value on that? Right? Where do you start counting dollars when you start that early? That's what disease.
I think, do we have time for one more question, or you can tell me?
Yeah, we have 5 minutes.
We have 5 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay, sure.
All right, this is from an anonymous attendee. Protecting communities using regulations is a powerful way to protect communities. Recently, companies are beginning to publicly say that they value partnership with communities. How do you see partnerships between communities, academia, and the private sector evolving to be more protective of people or consumers of products?
I mean, I hope it evolves that direction. The alternative direction would be, certainly despairing for it. But I think a lot of it's, going back to the also is really about, how organized are the communities, for it. And the more organized communities can be and more aware of the risks that they're facing, or the more they can really, be able to speak with, a really powerful voice to companies and to, regulators and policymakers, for it. And so I think it is evolving that direction because that's sort of the tidal shift of, partnerships with communities is, leading towards greater equity for it. But I think community organization and education are going to be really at the core of that.
Yeah, and I would point to the work of Jill Lindsay Harrison, if you are interested in this topic. She's a social scientist out of, I think she's still at University of Colorado Boulder, who's really looked at how some of these programs that require communities to partner with the private sector end up co-opting a lot of the more protective goals that those communities might have and turning the goals into something that it might be less transformative because they're forcing this common place of agreement. And so there's, those have a lot of promise, but I just look at Harrison's work for some areas to be aware of the pitfalls of forcing those kinds of partnerships.
Fantastic, thank you. Any final questions from the
question? So you mentioned the importance of community organizing, and I guess speaking specifically to farm workers, most of them are undocumented, and most of them you want to kind of be in the background or gain security through being like secretive or being under radar, I should say. So how do those communities, I mean, aside from the United Farmers Union, like how can we help those communities that can't actively or loudly organize? How do we prioritize their health, especially when they already experience so much stigmatism and there's immigration issues and racism, and most of them come from communities, and they're within those communities they experience racism as well, because many of our indigenous communities coming up to the United States as well.
Fantastic question, and I think that's partly where we don't see enough data in the United States for not just CKDU, but all sorts of diseases, including cardiovascular disease. And I think there's a huge role to play for the health systems. Local hospitals and health systems can play a big role in going to these communities and not expecting someone getting sick and then showing up at the hospital, but rather setting up community-based healthcare systems in farm agricultural communities, so in agricultural regions, and especially set up surveillance mechanisms so that you can at least get a sense of prevalence. And that's happening in, for example, in San Joaquin Valley in California, they've done that. They've actually gone to some of the farm workers and sort of ignored the nationality and the birthplace and birth date even, and then just said, let's just screen us. Let's just let us screen you. And we can do that across the US. Baylor College of Medicine has done that with farm workers coming from Mexico across the border to Texas. We can do that in North Carolina. Pretty much any health system, I think, in the US has the capacity to do that. And that's something I think we should really gear towards.
I just add there that we should remember that during the COVID emergency, when it was declared an emergency, ICE, the immigration agreed authority in this country not to do any ICE raids or surveillance or at COVID testing, at COVID vaccines, right? So that we actually can do this as a country. We actually, for that problem, lifted all of the use of immigration authority in healthcare access. So we know we can do it. Didn't last, but nevertheless.
I think given that we're at time, we're gonna wrap this up, but I appreciate the rich discussion we had. It's clear that we've come a long way, but there's still a lot to do. And just to summarize a couple of themes that came up, I think we've got to think about feedback loops with climate change leading to more exposures and more contamination and then more health effects. Kevin, I loved your point about it's not just increased exposure that leads to increased disease, it's also increased susceptibility to a given level of exposure that leads to disease. That is also an environmental justice issue. And then I think the point just now, which is we can't see a problem where we don't shine a light. So if we don't have the data, then we don't know there's a problem. So somebody at the back of the room said, this is a public health emergency. Why am I just hearing about CKDU for the first time? Well, honestly, CKDU may very well be here in the southern US, and we just don't know because we haven't shined a light there because we don't have data. It's a transient, very difficult to study population when you do have the threat of ice hanging over your head. I know this is a busy time of year for all of us, so thank you everybody for coming today. And I think this is the last Think Global of 2023, so we hope to see you next year. Yeah.